So this is going to be one of those videos that makes a very specific demographic of people angry. I am building a web3 data mining startup, or a couple of probably a suite of apps. Let's put it that way. That's one of the things that's going to make people mad because web3 really pisses people off. The other thing that's going to make people mad is that I started writing this in Rust and I stopped writing it in Rust because it really sucked. I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of developer speed and agility versus the language that you pick. And we're going to talk a little bit about my personal experiences with two different languages, one of them being Rust, the other one being Golang. I am not at all interested in participating in the language war because the people involved in it are incredibly annoying. So understand that this is coming from my perspective, having written a couple thousand lines of each. So when I started this, I knew that I wanted to hit some RPC endpoints, which are the endpoints that you can get information about Solana transactions. Solana is it's where all the meme coins come from. That's Solana. So I knew that I wanted to hit these RPC endpoints. I was going to pull down some very complicated structured JSON data from those RPC endpoints, and I'm going to parse those out and transform them into something more useful in order to do data mining on them. The data mining part is less important because right now the majority of my work is in the actual parsing of the transactions themselves. That is like the most important part. So when I first started this, I knew I wanted to do it in Rust for a couple of reasons. One, Rust is really fast. Two, Rust is really safe. And three, Solana is built on top of Rust. So there's a lot of like crossover in code that I could reuse and things like that. So I started writing. And I fairly quickly started beating my head against a wall. Now, I've written like thousands of lines of Rust over time. I'm not a Rust expert by any means. I'm fairly good with it. And, I ended up writing several hundred, probably, I think it was close to like 2,500 lines of Rust code before I gave it up. The issue that I ran into is the issue that a lot of people complain about with Rust. And that is that Rust is a great safe language. It's got some syntactical quirks. And those syntactical quirks, when you're first starting out, are just quirks that you just kind of have to learn. The things like lifetimes, for example, great example. Lifetimes don't exist in a lot of other languages because of the way that Rust handles, memory. You have to have lifetimes in Rust. And in the beginning, it was fairly easy for me to avoid them, but as time goes on, you end up finding different areas where you have to move variables around in very specific ways or move memory around in very specific ways. And that makes it kind of hard to do without having a deep understanding of lifetimes and a deep understanding of kind of like how Rust does memory. And on top of that deep understanding, you just have to do things certain ways. And I didn't have a great understanding of lifetimes and like Rust memory management in general. Basically, I had tried to avoid it as much as humanly possible. And I got to the point where I couldn't. So development slowed down. I started running into issues where I couldn't implement certain features because I was headbanging on these like quirks of the Rust language. And I realized there are other languages that I could do this in, and it will still be pretty fast. Here's one of the more important pieces of context here. One of the reasons why Rust is really fast is the way that it handles memory. That same thing that I was talking about where there's like quirkiness with the language, that is also what makes Rust really fast and what makes Rust really safe. But the handling of memory is not going to be the largest bottleneck in this particular instance. I'm making calls out to RPC nodes like thousands of times a second, or hundreds of times a second at least. There's a pretty significant amount of bandwidth between my server and the RPC node that I'm dealing with. That bandwidth is going to be the main bottleneck. That's going to be significantly larger than any kind of memory issue that I'm dealing with on the end server. So I'm sitting here wrestling against this language where I'm not really able to implement features as fast as I want so that I can make very, very minimal gains compared to a language like Golang, which uses, basically a garbage collector to deal with memory. The garbage collector part is not going to take near as long in the grand scheme of things as the bandwidth that I'm dealing with between my server and the RPC node. And a lot of Rust people's immediate response would be like, okay, well, yeah, but there is going to be overhead. So why don't you go ahead and eliminate that by, using Rust? Well, there's also the overhead of the fact that I'm not that good at Rust. And there's a lot of quirks with the language, and there's a lot of things to kind of deal with respect to parsing as well. I personally don't love the way that you have to structure your code in order to parse things with Rust, in order to parse JSON out into, structures. I like the way that Golang does it way better. It's a lot easier, it's a lot more straightforward, and that's the crux of it. I'm not super worried about the overhead that comes with using a garbage collected language versus a language like Rust when one of the primary bottlenecks is the actual bandwidth between my server and the RPC node, and two, the secondary and possibly even like the first bottleneck in terms of like speed cost is I'm not able to implement features very fast. So I switched to Golang. I was able to like immediately implement all of the features that I had in the Rust example or the Rust version within like a couple days, maybe a week, let's say a week. And then I was able to add tons of new features on top of that in just a couple of days, which would have taken me forever in Rust because I would have been sitting there just banging my head against the wall. This doesn't mean that Rust is a bad language. This is a skill issue on my part, and it's just a speed of development thing, which again has a lot to do with my own skill with the language, but it also has to do with the fact that Golang is objectively a much simpler language from the perspective of syntax. It's a lot easier to use. It's a lot easier to implement things like multi-threading. I was able to use Go channels very, very quickly to immediately handle a lot of the concurrency issues that, I was having to try to implement in Rust. It's a lot easier. So, when you're trying to think of what language to use for a certain problem set, let's limit this discussion to just like backend or data stuff. So we're not talking about JavaScript frontends or anything like that. And let's just talk about the backend stuff. When you're trying to figure out which language to use, it's actually fairly important to take into consideration which language you can develop out features for the fastest. Yeah, Rust is like a really shiny object right now. It's like a really cool language. And again, it's a great language. It's super fast, and there are certain applications that I'll continue using Rust for. But if I want to add features really quickly using a really great backend language, if I want to use stuff like concurrency and multi-threading, Golang's a pretty great choice, especially if you are like me going to be jumping into the Go and HTMX cult. That's like going to be the next week or two of my life is trying to figure that stuff out. It's just a really good choice. It's not because Golang is a better language than Rust. It's because for me personally, I can implement features way faster in Go versus Rust. The quirks in Rust to me weren't worth the amount of time that I was spending on them. So there's my language rant. Development is going very, very well. Developing out parsers is slow going, takes a while, but it's doable. I'll probably be doing a couple of videos on like Solana RPC nodes and Solana transactions, the way they work and all of that. So be on the lookout for those, and I'll probably do a couple of code reviews on this maybe at some point in the future. I'm looking to kind of flesh out a business plan for this data mining project. It's going to take me a little while to get there, but eventually I will. That's about it. Take it easy. Peace.